Hello and welcome to today's session on Global Azure 2022. My name is Martina Grom. I'm located in Vienna, Austria. I'm an Azure MVP and Regional Director. I care a lot about security, and today I'm here with my colleague, Toni Pohl.
Hi guys, my name is Toni. I'm an IT consultant and I'm working together with Martina in our company at work.at. You can see our contact details here on the slide. And from my heart, I'm a software developer, but I'm found out that securing your resources in Azure is a very important topic for most of our customers. And so this is the idea where we came to this session titled Secure Your Enterprise Applications with Azure. And we will have a lot of demos to show you what you can do, how you can secure your resources in the following hour.
And to begin with that, I just want a short introduction. We do a lot of governance, security, and compliance with our customers. And what we always learn is that security and compliance is a very broad space. And that means if you look at our presentation, it's always a discussion about how can we move workloads and data to the cloud. We have always the discussion that the customer says, okay, the cloud is not safe. How can we protect our data in the cloud? Or Microsoft is not a secure cloud service. We have legal compliance, we have requirements, regulations, and so on. And how can we do that? And when we designed that session, we talked a little bit about that because it could be a workshop, a full day workshop, only talking about governance, security, and compliance, and all the concepts we have within there. But what we tried today is that Toni and I show you some of the basic concepts, how you can start with enterprise governance and security out of a development perspective. Because in previous time, it was all, I have access to everything. I have my demo environment, and I can do everything. And now we are in a secure space, which as Azure is by default. And how can I handle it and improve the security? Because it's based on, is it an infrastructure as a service, or is it platform as a service, or are we in a SaaS service? And from the examples we have here, we can talk about Azure Active Directory, identity security, and so on. There is a huge Azure Security Center where you see a lot of improvement actions by default and so on. Toni will show what happens if you store your credentials and certificates within Key Vault, and so on, and how many services are here in the interaction. We also have a slide with the most important links in the beginning where you see all the offerings Microsoft is doing from a security perspective, that you see, okay, I have to secure my infrastructure, my operational security, and so on. And you can also look at the Azure Compliance Center, or I would really recommend read the Microsoft security blog. And I'm one of the Azure security MVPs, and it's mind-blowing. Almost every day I get new links which are published on the security blog where people say, okay, this is new, this is new, this is new, and it's an evergreen service. And there's a lot of improvement out of the security space because Microsoft has to take care about that. Also, think about that. Microsoft has to provide baseline security and ISO certifications for every customer. And that also means from a baseline security perspective, when you are starting with a cloud service, this is one of the basic improvements you can have if you start with Microsoft Azure. So to show you a little picture how every service works together. And this is quite funny because from my history, I started with Microsoft 365, which was called Office 365, which was called Business Productivity Online Service. And out of an architecture perspective, Microsoft 365 is kind of a sub-service of Azure because it runs partially on Azure services or on bare metal services. And this picture, we tried to show you what is connected to what and how you can improve it through security. So if you look at that, the baseline of everything from a security perspective is currently called Microsoft Defender. There is Microsoft Defender for Identity. There's Defender for Office 365. Also, you have Defender for endpoint protection, and you also have Microsoft Defender for cloud apps, and everything is scoped into the Microsoft 365 Defender portal, where you can see everything is connected and it's dots which are connected from a security perspective, where you can really see what happens in there. Also, we have the Azure Security Center and Microsoft Defender for Cloud Services reports into the Azure Security Center. So that also means Microsoft is no longer considered to be a non-security provider. It's more considered as somebody who helps you secure your environment. If we look at our next topic is, and this is also something what we get asked a lot in the beginning, it's how should I begin? It's so much to do, and what are the best things I can consider there? So first of all, identify your use cases and build up a strategy. So what we do, and you probably have heard the buzzword zero trust deployment models and so on. You can't go from 0 to 100, but you can go with a definition of use cases that you say, okay, I look at my workloads, I think about what is the first service I want to move into the cloud. It could be virtual machines, a typical lift and shift scenario. So take your on-premises data center and shift it into Azure. Or you can go in there from a business perspective and said, okay, I have a couple of enterprise apps. I need to protect them. And how can I do that? And I also need to have a governance around there. And the last 2 points are, how can I secure my PowerShell scripts? And there's also a good approach. Toni will show that through automation accounts, where you can say, okay, this PowerShell runs in Azure on a scheduled time and so on. And the last point is business workflows, which is a huge topic by itself. It's all around the Power Platform and what you can do there. That being said, I'm now ready with my slides, and we will go into the demo, and I hand over to Toni.
Okay, great. So what I learned now is everything is called Microsoft Defender Star. So we have a lot of services we can use to secure our resources in Azure. So my first tip here is we see different workloads like virtual machines, load balancers, app services, automation accounts, and so on. My first tip is simply to use the Azure Advisor. And for those of you who don't know Azure Advisor already, let me show you that quickly. I have a demo account here, and I'm simply searching for Advisor, because this advisor is really useful from my perspective. It has various categories from a cost perspective, security, reliability, and so on. And you can see here in that demo tenant, I have a lot of recommendations here. And if I look into the security, we will see that I have, for example, a virtual machine where the advisor says, well, there's a high impact, I should install endpoint protection. And if I scroll down a little bit, maybe there's an app service where there's still FTPS allowed, and so on. And for example, I have an automation account where I have a variable that's not encrypted, but when I click on that, I will see what's the topic here. I see, well, there's a variable called tenant ID, including the tenant ID of this tenant here, and that's not encrypted, and that should be encrypted. And so this is very useful. What I like here is in the advisor that it gives you really useful recommendations, and you are able to say, exempt this. Okay, I know this is an issue, or I say I can live with this issue, I deny it, or I exempt it for future recommendations. So I think this is a really good start for every administrator to check your Azure resources with the Azure Advisor to see what you should improve here. The second part, which I want to show you here, is VMs. And to save a little bit time, I just want to point out some things here. If you're working with a lift and shift approach, or if you're running virtual machines in the cloud, there are some recommendations here as well. So first of all, when you create a new virtual machine, when you create a network security group, do it at least as basic or advanced, and say, I don't have any public inbound ports. And once you created that virtual machine here, Azure gives you the recommendation to improve the security by enabling just-in-time access. And this is a good thing from my perspective, which improves security a lot, to say, I only allow access to this virtual machine, first of all, at a specific time, or only for a specific time frame, and secondly, only from specific, let's say, IP addresses, for example. So I just have screenshotted the process here. If you want to follow that, you can simply enable that. And this requires the Defender for Cloud. Again, everything is Microsoft Defender now. So Defender for Cloud has to be enabled, and this comes with cost. So always take in mind that if you enable such a service, always have a look at the costs. Here you can see total for resources on the left. What would it cost for me for my subscription? What are the costs if I enable this for this one server? So if you enable this here, you just get the information, okay, it's now enabled. And what's happening behind the scenes is that this creates a temporary rule in the firewall. Here you can see in the line 2 here, that says, okay, deny and allow. That's a temporary rule where Azure takes care that this policy is compliant. So if you, for example, access that, you can also enforce that with a policy, which would be a recommendation to say, please create a policy which only allows specific, let's say, IP addresses or within a specific time frame, and I apply this policy to all of my virtual machines. So this is just a screenshot how this would look like. And if all of that is enabled and you say, I want to access that virtual machine with from all configured IPs here, it would say, well, I don't allow that. You're not allowed to open that machine here from an unknown IP address. But if you say, I go to my IP address, then the cheat in that case says, well, you're allowed to access this resource. I just wanted to save some time here and give you the idea that this is an important thing if you're working with infrastructure as a service. And this is really a recommendation from my side to use JIT as far as possible and to use policies. The second part, of course, is the big part, enterprise applications. So securing services, I need to have an identity to access any service in Azure. And the basis identity, Microsoft today calls it modern authentication. In the background, this is nothing else than a client requests a resource, and the resource says, well, you need to have authentication. It redirects me to the authorization server. The authorization server checks who is the owner of that resource. Has the resource owner who owns this resource given the access, has allowed access, has granted the access to this resource? And if yes, I send back a token to the server and say, okay, this token allows you to access this resource. And this is a big topic because, for example, maybe you've heard Microsoft is turning off the basic authentication, for example, for Exchange in October. I have a slide later for that in this presentation. So we should use modern authentication wherever possible to secure resources. So how does this look like in reality? What does this mean here? So I have a short app demo here just to give you a real world context here. So if I go to my Azure Active Directory and I go to the app registrations, I can create such an application here that gives me access to specific resources. So I simply click on new registration here, give the application a name, Global Azure 2, for example. And then I decide, okay, who gets access to this application? In my case, I select only members of that tenant, single tenant get access. I don't need to, I don't say it's a web application or so. I just register this application. It's only a name that creates an app ID for me. And the second part, which I need to do, where does this, to which resources does this application have permissions? So I simply go to the app permissions. You can see this app is only allowed to log in from a with a user. So I can go here and say I add permissions, and we will use this application later. So I say I want to access the Microsoft Graph. I want to read users or create a new team or something like this. And here I decide with that resource provider, do I want to authenticate with a user or do I want to authenticate with an application? So the difference is the application runs as a scheduled task, for example, as a cron job, as something that is automated. I don't have any user interaction. If I say the user needs to log into my application, I would select the delegated administration permissions. So here I select the application permissions, and what I said before, I want to access users with Graph. So I simply go to this scope here and say, I want to read all the users in that tenant. And secondly, I want to read also the groups in that tenant, which is only group. So I go to group and say, oh, okay, this is the permission I'm looking for, group read write all. There's also a directory permission here. For example, if I want to read the tenant ID or any other information like devices or similar things, directory read all. So I simply select these permissions as an application, and then you can see I, as the owner of that application, I can now decide if I trust this application to access these resources. You can see here the status says it's not granted. So I, as an administrator, can do that for my tenant, but there's only I need to grant the admin consent here, and once I do this, you will see that I now have granted this for TPE5, for example. And the last part, how do I authenticate with this application? Well, I need a second factor. I need a password. I need a certificate or something like this. So in this scenario, I simply go to the certificates and secrets. I say I create a password, which is called client secret here. So I go here and say, okay, I give that secret a name. So I name it secret, for example, and I say it expires in 6 months or so. This is okay. The never expires has been removed by Microsoft. So the maximum time is now 24 months. So I say the secret expires in 6 months, and then I get a value. Important, you only get this value now once and never again. So if you forget this value here, you need to recreate a new secret, and you have to renew that for your applications as well. So what I usually recommend here, let's go to a notepad and simply paste this information in here. So that's my secret. And I also will need to have the other data like the application ID and the tenant ID. So let's copy this here. Once the copy mechanism is available again. Oops, here we go. So I simply copy that to my notepad because I will use that later. That's my app ID. And I often use also the directory tenant ID. So these are the main informations I need, or it's called tenant ID. Perfect. So what can I do with this information, with this application? I've defined some permissions. So what's this flow with the token? How can I secure that? I have a small PowerShell script for that, where I can simply copy these things. I simply have tried it out before. So I simply now go to my notepad and simply paste in that data here, and I want to use this application. So I say this is my app ID here, which is this one. And what I'm doing here, I'm accessing the login Microsoft.com endpoint to get a token here. So the tenant ID is the same because I tried it within this tenant. Perfect. So I have a function here. I'm calling graph, and I say, okay, I want to have these parameters here. This is the login process here. And what I'm doing here, I'm using this flow called client credentials to log in as an application here. And here's the post method where I say I pass the data to the endpoint. And what I get back here is an authorization period. It's the token. And just for demo purposes, I write the token to a text file because I want to show you what's happening behind the scenes here. So I simply run this script here. That's also available on my GitHub repository. I will show that later. You can see it worked. I got back a bearer, and that bearer has been written to the token txt file, which is this one here. So if I copy this, and this is important from an administrative perspective as well, I can go to chat.ms, for example, and simply have a look what's in that token. And this is what the token what the token contains here. It says who is the provider, who is the issuer of that token, how long is it valid, and it also shows me the permissions which I have selected. And the important part, this is a really cool feature here of the .ms website. If I go to claims, you get an explanation of that, and it also decodes how long the token is valid. You can see this token was issued right now at 15:15, so some minutes ago, and this is valid only for 1 hour. And here, for example, I see that's the name of the application, Global Azure 2, and so on. And this is a really cool thing where you get the explanation for this token here. So this is what we can use now to access these resources, and we will use that a little bit later then. Okay, with that, the next information, which is important, how can I safely store these credentials? So for that, we have Azure Key Vault. Azure Key Vault is, I don't need to type Azure here actually. So I already have created a Key Vault. So you never should put that secret or this information directly into a connection string or into a script or so. So never do what I did here, that you have the data directly in a script or so. And also, please use this jot.ms here, this website, which is in this browser here. Use it only for demo purposes, not for productive tenants. This is really just for getting the information so that you're able to decode the token to see what's in there. Don't do this with real data, of course. Okay, so I have now this data here. Where should I store it? Well, I can create such a key vault here, and I did this here with the MySafe here. And the MySafe is an Azure service that's made for exactly storing such secrets, such information. And you can see I can store certificates, secrets, keys, and so on. And of course, I need to define who has access to that safe. So this is everything here is of course encrypted. So I can go to secrets, for example. You can see I already have added some secrets here. So now I simply add the next key here and say, okay, that's I call it secret 2 here. And the value for that is what I have in here. That's this secret here. So I simply paste it here. So this is the wonderful key I created and save it. Another benefit of this here is that we can store multiple versions. So this is the current version, and I could update that very easily in this one central storage and say, I create a new version for that. I can define the expiration date and so on. So this is really an important thing. Every secret in Azure should be stored in such a key vault if possible. So that's my next recommendation here. I also have a short slide for that where you find the information with a link if you're new to Azure Key Vault, where you can find more information. When we create such applications, I want to point out there's also another cool thing we can use to secure our data, which is a so-called managed identity. So we have just created an application, and in the background, when I create an application, Azure creates a so-called service principal name for that resource, which is used for assigning all the permissions, which is more or less a definition, what policies, what permissions does this application have in this specific tenant. A managed identity is a very cool thing we can use for accessing resources within Azure. So for example, if I have something like an Azure Logic app or an Azure function or an Azure automation account or Azure Kubernetes services or a virtual machine or so, we can use these managed identities. The benefit of that is that we don't need to care about the management of this managed identity. Azure takes care of that itself. And you can see here, I copied that from the Microsoft Help page system. You have this available for various resources, and we have 2 types of these managed identities. I will show you that instantly. So let me go to a Logic app here. So here I have a Logic app that's called Logic App Get Users. And how can I use Key Vault, or how can I use managed identity in here? So what does this application, this small business process here do? We can see we have an HTTP trigger when I run this trigger, which is this endpoint here. And what does it do? It accesses a resource. In that case, it's an Azure function I wrote, which simply says, please give me data from the graph or something like this. And I need to authenticate here. And what you can see here, we see we have a client ID, and we pass the secret, and this is the secret of the other application of the global Azure application 1. So again, this information should never be part of our logic, of our script, or of our logic app, or of our automation account, or our code. So how can I prove this? Well, I have 2 steps here. We have created an Azure Key Vault, so I can use this for getting the secret. So how do I access this Key Vault? Well, now there comes the managed identity in place. So I go here to my get users, and almost every resource here has a menu that's called identity. So I simply click on identity, and here you can see there are 2 types of these managed identities. There's system assigned and user assigned. System assigned, let me go back to the presentation very quickly, just to show you that. System assigned means I need this identity only for this specific resource, in my case, only for my own logic app. If I want to use one identity within Azure for multiple resources, let's say for 10 logic apps or 10 PowerShell scripts or whatever, then I would use a user-assigned. The benefit here is that I can use this user-assigned identity to access multiple resources, or from multiple resources into one resource, which means I can access other Azure resources, or I can access a common key vault, for example. And that's the difference between these 2 types here. So if I go to user assigned, I would need to add the user. In my case, I want to show you the system assigned identity. So you can switch it on, which is by default off, and you save that. And what's happening behind the scenes is that this operation here creates an application in Azure. So what we've done before manually by creating this global Azure 2 application, now it's done in the background for me. And what I get back is just an ID, an identity, which is this object principal here, which is valid only for the logic app get users here. So that's step 1. So I have identified from this target, I want to access another Azure resource. And the big next benefit is that this application, this system identity, is only valid within the Azure platform. So it cannot leave the Azure platform. I cannot do anything outside of the Azure platform with that system assigned managed identity or with the user assigned identity. So this is the first part where we say we want to access an Azure Key Vault from this logic app. Perfect. The next step, let's go to our Key Vault here and say we have this MySafe1 here. And the Key Vault has a specific property that's called access policies. So if we go into this here, we will see who has access to that Key Vault, MySafe1. You can see by default, that's my account, which is Toni at that tenant here. And I can add an access policy for this logic app I just created the system managed identity. So I simply click on Add Access Policy. I want that the logic app also gets access to it. So now I need to define to which secrets within that MySafe does this logic app need permissions to read. So in my case, I say, well, this application shall just have access to keys and secret, not to certificates, for example. So I select some of the types here. Then the key permissions, what is this application allowed to do with this policy? It would be allowed to update, create, import, and so on. And I say, for example, okay, you're only allowed to get and to list the keys here, the secrets which I store in this MySafe. And so on. So you can see I can granularly define what kind of permissions I want to give this application. And now I need to select the principal. And the principal here, in my case, it's called logic apps. If I type it correctly, logic app get user. So this is the application, in my case, the resource that needs to have access to the MySafe. So I select the logic app get users, and more or less this is it. So now in this wizard, I have defined who shall get access, and I add this, and now you can see this is added. Now, please don't forget to save this policy, otherwise the logic app simply doesn't get the access to this save here. So this is a step I usually forget, and then you have to redo it again. So simply click save here. Okay, now that I've done that, let's try it out. Go back to our logic app here. We have defined that this application shall get access here, and we want to improve that logic app here by going to the designer and simply add another step here and say, I don't want to hard code the secrets of that application in here. I want to go to the key vault. So once this is loaded, so we add a step here and say add an action. I search for key vault. To continue typing doesn't help because the find method always needs some seconds. So I hope this action here will be found quickly. Here we want to access the Azure Key Vault. And then it asks me, what do I want to do with that Key Vault? I want to get a secret. So let's search for get. In my case, I just want to get the secret from the Key Vault. So I simply click get secret here. And now you see, how do I connect to that Key Vault? And in the past, we would say we connect with a specific, also hard-coded credentials. In my case, I can use this connect with managed identity, which says preview. So now I have to type the name for the connection, and the name is MySafe1. And that's also the name of the Key Vault. And you can see I want to access that with a system assigned managed identity. So I click create here. And let's keep the fingers crossed. So this policy should work, hopefully, that we are now able to connect to that Key Vault from our Logic app with this managed identity. Obviously it worked. If I open that and now the secrets are loaded, it worked perfectly. And this now says, well, there are 3 keys in there, 3 secrets. So I say, I want to use the secret 2, please. I should give it a nice name, get secret 2, for example, because I want to use that name of the action in that HTTP call here. And here you can see I call my Azure function here with the function code. And here, instead of this here, let's remove that and say we want to get the value of this get secret 2. Of course, I could repeat this for the other things here as well, but just let's try it out what this thing does here. So I could call the graph or any other resource as well here. I just wanted to use my own function to show you how you can handle or how you can work with that, what I'm doing here in this function here. So I have opened Visual Studio here. That's a .NET 6 application. And here I have 2 methods here. And I have one method that's called function graph here. And you can open that anonymically, so you don't need to authenticate. But I said, well, if I run this function here, I want to read the header, I want to read the bureau that's coming with that HTTP request. Then I split the token here to say, okay, that's the bureau, that's the token. And with that token, I open a graph client here connecting to graph and say, I want to use the SDK here to say, give me a list of the users with that token. So this function knows nothing about authentication, or so it just says, give me the token that is passed in the header of that request here. And if that works, I simply return these users here as a list. So let's try it out. Let's go back. I already have implemented this here in this address here, and that in this endpoint here. And now we are using that secret, and the rest of the action is just to compose, read the body from that to see what's coming back here. So let's run this and see what's happening in this Logic app. And I chose a Logic app because I think that's very useful, not only for trying out things, but also for small business processes. You can see, obviously something was wrong. In my case, the function returned an error here. Maybe I forgot something. So let me do one thing here. Let me switch it to my secret 1, which is the other application I created before, just to show you that this actually should work. So let's run this trigger again here with the other secret, which follows the same concept here. And calling this Azure function, which we also need to secure later maybe. But in this case, with that key, it worked. So maybe I've made some mistakes somewhere in the definition of the application. But we should get an HTTP 200. And you can see basically the call worked. I got back a list of the users of that tenant here, and the compose shows me the same data here. There's one important thing which is useful when using Logic apps here as well, because if I open the get secret, you could see the secret here itself. So this is my secret 1. So if just against curious eyes or so, you can obfocus, you can hide that secret here. by going to the settings here and say security outputs or security input. So if I say security outputs of this step here of this application, and I click say it done here, and I save this, and I run this application again, once this is saved now, so call that endpoint here, we should see that the logic app now doesn't show me this secret because this action simply hides it. So if I look at this, you will see now that the output there is not shown due to security configuration. So if somebody is looking over your shoulder, he's not able to see that secret which is stored in the key vault. Of course, in the background, this is available, but at least here in the designer, you will not see that. Also, if I look at the HTTP inputs, it says content not shown due to security configuration, which is, I think, also a useful thing you can use in here. Another thing you can use in almost every Azure resource is the network. So for example, this is not known by so many people. That's something. Maybe I was too fast a little bit. Oh no, for logic apps, it's not called network, it's called workflow settings, which is this one. You can control the access to this logic app that does some business logic with maybe some secrets that are stored in the key vault. Theoretically, you could call it from everywhere. You can restrict that and say, well, this is only valid to be called from other logic apps. And I think this is important as well, because usually you say this business process should not be called from anywhere outside. I just want to be able to call it from another logic app, from another endpoint, from a specific IP address. Or you could also say, well, this isn't only allowed from other logic apps, but this doesn't have an HTTP trigger that is triggered with the HTTP endpoint, but this runs on a daily basis, let's say at 2 o'clock in the night or something. So that's also, from a security perspective, an important information I want to pass on here. Okay, with that, let me show you another sample here. Let's go to the next thing, to Azure automation accounts, because I want to show you how you can access data with a certificate. So Azure automation accounts are also a very good thing to put your scripts into Azure, to run them on a daily basis, or to say, I want to have a specific workflow. Let's say I want to create a team with a PowerShell script or with a Python script or something like this. And there are two things which are very useful here, because automation accounts makes it very easy for administrators to run their scripts without using key vault, creating an extra key vault and so on. So let me show you how this works. So I go to automation accounts here in my demo tenant. I've created one, it's called Global Azure 1. Maybe before I show this, I want to show you when you create such an automation account in your Azure subscription, there are two things that are important here. So I would say put it in this and in a specific region and so on. I give it a name, Global Azure 2, something like this. And if I go to advanced here, you can see this already has system assigned activated, which means this here is using this managed identity to access specific resources within Azure. Let's say they built in a key vault or some other things. And you can also say, I don't want these automation account scripts to be available publicly. I just want to allow them to be called from a private access. So these are things you should also keep in mind. You can secure already by creating such an Azure automation account here. Okay, so with that, let's go back to my global Azure where I already did this. So this works basically very easily. So this is like a virtual machine that is available for you, and where you can install your PowerShell modules here. And for example, I already installed PowerShell modules for Graph because I want to access the Microsoft Graph here as well. And I also installed one for Teams, which is also available here. Keep in mind, if you're using Azure automation accounts, you need to take care of the runtime version. So I did it with the PowerShell core version with 7.1. You can mix them, but then you cannot use you cannot mix them within a script. So keep in mind that you always stick with the same version here. Okay, so the next part, I have a runbook. And in this runbook, I want to read all the teams that are available in this Microsoft tenant here. So how do I do this? Well, I need to connect against, in that case, graph again. So what does the script do here? So I click on edit. I don't want to give feedback. I just wanted to open it. I need to authenticate. And this automation account gives me a very cool method to access such secrets with an automatically created key vault in the background of Azure automation accounts. I don't need to do that manually. So I can go to the assets here and you can see I go to credentials, for example, and I have added an administrator credential. So I can simply say add to canvas. And this is the command here I can use to access a credential I have stored in here. And this is what I'm doing here. I'm accessing this credential, and this credential has a username and a password. Then I connect to Teams, and then I say, give me a list of the teams with the PowerShell module, which I included before. This is a process of some minutes, and then I simply make an output of what comes back from this here. So let me show you that, how we stored it. So one thing, I duplicate this tab here to run it because the run method usually takes a minute or so. Well, let's start it here. I click on here, run. You can see I can also add a schedule, or I can run it from a webhook. So I say start this script here, which now gives me this screen here and says, here's the output of that screen. So it usually takes a moment to spin up that virtual machine, to load that script, to run the modules, to run it. You can see I get the data already. How do I store such information in such a runbook here? Well, actually, it's easy. So if I close this because the designer doesn't show me that here, go to my global Azure automation account. And here you can see in this shared resources, I can add my credentials and my certificates. So if I go to credentials, you can see there's one credential like my admin here. This works very smoothly. I say I give that a name. I say this is the username, Toni at TPE5 something. And this is my password, and this is the confirmation of my password. So it's very easy to use it here. And once I have created this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, now you know my password. So let's see if, obviously, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now I can create this credential here. And this is what I'm using in that script here. So you can see it's very easy to use it. And this is stored in this automatically created key vault. So what's happening here behind the scenes, I started the script here. You can see I'm using this credential. I'm using that password that is stored. I cannot access that password. So you can change it, but I cannot read it here. So this is also one of the benefits here. And here I get a list of all the teams that are available in this tenant. So you can see you're very flexible with that. I also have another script using the same thing here. If I look at edit, what's happening in here, you can, by the way, download these scripts from my GitHub directory, which I will show you then. So here I want to have 2 parameters, and I'm doing the same here, get automation account of that administrator, connect to the team. Then I say, please create a new team with that PowerShell that's of the type private. And I add some owner, I add 1 owner, so I add some members here, and this is it. So let me run this here as well. Just as a small proof of concept, I say that's my team global Azure. If I type in the correct field here, oh, here we go. And the owner is myself. Okay, and this is it. I've now started this script here. So you can also use your credentials in the Azure automation accounts as well. Again, that's very easy to use. You don't need to do anything else. You don't need to create an extra key vault or so. But of course, you can also connect to an external key vault and use credentials from there. There's a script for that as well. Okay, so here, let's just have a look at the output of that. In this case, I wanted to create a team here, and this should happen soon. In the meantime, I go to teamsmicrosoft.com just to see if this is running. And I'm running almost out of time. So let me go back to my presentation and show you the thing what I said before, which is one thing. Here we go. So you should never use username and password itself instead of this use modern authentication. Or if you're working, for example, with Graph or with Exchange or so, as Microsoft announced, well, we will switch off basic authentication this October, and this time we really mean it. How can you access Exchange, for example, from an Azure Automation account without username and password? Well, there's a method for this, and this method is very easily to use. So you can create a self-signed certificate, and I just want to show you the process here. You can see here that this team now has been created. So let's have a look at my Teams client. Here it is, and I've added a Teams template for that. You can see I get a little bit more, some more channels here, just as a proof of concept, manage teams. There should be some guests in here as well. So this basically worked well. Good. So how can you do this? For this, I want to show you how to do this in your environment. So I simply have this PowerShell script where I say, I want to create a certificate. I give it a name. In my case, I say that's Global Azure 2, and I simply run this script. What this PowerShell script does, it creates me a new certificate in my store here. So if I open now the management console, which is on my other screen, but you will see it in a second here once it's started. I just need to move it here. You add the snap in for certificates. This one here, I created it in my user account, so I simply add this here. You can see that I have now created this certificate, my Global Azure 2. And I said it should be valid for 5 years here. So if you want to use that, you simply go here, say I want to export this certificate. And I want to export the private key for this as well and save this with a password. In my case, I say the password is, let's take this one here, simply the name of that certificate. So select it and save that. And for accessing this here, so I do it put it into my download. Oh, here we go. We are already here. My Azure Global Azure 2. You would need to do the same for adding this public key then. This is the private key for the application. For this certificate, you would also need to export it with the public key only. In this case, no. So we have the serve file as well. So Azure, that's my Azure 2. And this is it. And the benefit when I've done this, so let me show you that. So these are my two, or this is my certificate. The one contains the private key. The second one contains only the public key. So I could go here to my application and I don't want to do it right now, but I want to show you the process here. You can go to your app registrations. You can go to the application you created. And I did this here once it's loaded for my Global Azure 1. So here it is. And here I uploaded the certificate for the one which I created before, on this day before. So here we go. So that's the thumbprint of that. And what you then can do, you can go to the Azure Global Azure Automation account, go to certificates and upload the PFX. And the benefit here is, if I give that a name here, like my Global Azure 2, and I select this file here, in that case, the one with the private key here, you can see that I need to add the password here, and I can say it's exportable nodes, which means this is also a benefit from a security perspective, because then your administrators cannot download that certificate. They can use it within this specific Global Azure 1 administration account, automation account, but they cannot export it. And this is also, they need to have the password. So I did this here with this other one, with this my company certificate with the date of today. And then I created a connection to that. And that connection simply gives you, let me show you, you have to add your application where this certificate with the public key is bound to. You add your tenant, you add the thumbprint of that, what was the output of our script here, which was in that case for the 2. So I would use that. And then if you need the subscription ID. And then you can use this connection for accessing that connection with the certificate instead of a user. So this is the much better approach here. And just to show you this, how you can use it, if we go to edit here, we see that we have this automation account we are using from here. So this is the connection we are using. It's the My Company 06. I'm using tenant ID. I connect to the graph in that case with the certification thumbprint, depending on the connection you're using. And if I run this here, we will see that we should be able to connect to Microsoft Graph with the application, with the permissions of the application, and we authenticate with the thumbprint, or better, with the certificate we have added to our automation account. So we will see how this looks like a little bit later. The last part, just because I'm running out of time, I'm sorry for that. We see that we get a result here. So we see that it worked, the access here. You can also secure your app services by simply adding an Azure Authentication to your app service. This is valid for Azure Functions, for applications in here. And one last tip here, you can use the Azure Key Vault in the configuration settings of an Azure application itself, which means you simply have to use this syntax here to say, I want to access this endpoint, this key vault, and this is the secret. And you can simply add that to the application service. So I have a function app here, which is this one here. So I could go to the configuration, and in that configuration, I can simply use this string here instead of providing a hard-coded value. So if I click on here, show the values, you can see there are some values here. And this is you can use the syntax from the slide and put it in here to automatically access that key vault. But of course, this also works with a managed identity because the application must have access to this key vault. So it's very easy to use, and it's very effective to use these settings here as well. If you want to add authentication to your applications, there are very nice resources for that. So here's a resource for how to get started with a .NET Core application, for example, or with other programming languages. And this is also one thing I really would recommend to do that. One last part here, logging and monitoring. This is in the diagnose settings of almost every resource here. So in this case, I have used this function app here, and I've added an application insights, I think, or maybe it wasn't this one. Not so sure about this, if it was that resource or another. Yeah, here we go. So I linked it here, the application insights. And this is also a very useful thing from a security perspective, to go to the logs here and simply see what's happening in my application here. So this gives you information about the requests, for example. So what's really happening in here can be shown here with the requests table. And then you can see, okay, what has been called, like I called the graph before, for example. Or I can go to the other table here and say, maybe there have been exceptions or other things which I'm logging here. Let's say exceptions. Let's see if something happened here. Nothing happened, nothing bad happened here. So this is also a very important thing to add to every resource, some kind of monitoring. Okay, with that, I'm sorry for taking too much time here. Here's my summary for secure enterprise applications with Azure. I think the most important part is identify your use cases. Try to use the Azure Advisor. It's really useful from a monitoring, from a security perspective. We have added this point here, always consider PaaS. So we are big fans of platform as a service. We usually recommend not to use infrastructure as a service, because then you have much more things to monitor and to manage, and especially from a security perspective. I hope I could show you how to use managed identities, how you can use certificates, and how you can use key vaults for securing your credentials. And again, please use the built-in functionality like application insights, network settings. Don't call this logic app only from another logic app, and so on. And logging and monitoring is the last part. Okay, this is it. I was quick. I hope it was useful. Many thanks for your time and for joining us here on this Friday afternoon. You can find my samples here on my GitHub repository. Also the presentation, we will upload it in the next hour or so. So you can download it from here. And I hope it was useful. Many thanks for your time. Have a nice rest of this day. I think there's another session coming in at the full hour. Many thanks.